Welcome to the Torah series, where we explore the timeless wisdom of the Bible. In this episode, we will explore the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is a powerful and complex text that has been interpreted and reinterpreted for centuries. It is a story of creation, fall, and redemption, and it offers us a glimpse into the nature of God and the human condition. We shall begin exploring the Torah series from the creation. It is said in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. God then decided to bring light, as written in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God separated the light from the darkness, as said in Genesis chapter 1 verse 5. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning. And we could say it is the first day on earth. On the second day, as written in Genesis chapter 1 verse 6, God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So, he made a sky to separate the water above from the water below. As explained in Genesis chapter 1, verses 9 to 12, on day 3, God said, "Let the dry land appear," and it did appear with all kinds of vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them, according to their kind. On day 4, God declared that the lights in the sky should be for signs, seasons, days and years. So, he set two great lights, the sun to govern the day, and the moon to govern the night, and made the stars, which is beautifully described in Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 to 19. Further, on day 5, in Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So, God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. On day 6, God said, "Let us make mankind in our image." So he created them male and female. And he blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it," as said in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28. Finally, in Genesis chapter 2 verse 2, by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So, on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. In Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we see that God created a perfect world with light as its essential element. He saw that all of his creations are good, and he gave humankind the task of tending to and expanding his creation. Further, it is also crucial to note that rest is necessary. The creation story in Genesis is full of beauty and wonder, but as we continue, it brings a tragic tale, which we will discuss under the fall of man. Here, we will explore how sin entered our world. It is written in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. We could see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 that the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So this shows us that God created Adam from the dust of the earth and then brought him to life by breathing into him. After creating Adam, God placed him in the Garden of Eden and gave him the task of tending to it, as written in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. We can imagine that during this time, God spent much time with Adam, teaching him about the world he had created and the responsibility of caring for it. However, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, God recognized that it was not good for Adam to be alone. So, he created Eve as a helper and companion for Adam from one of his ribs, written in Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 and 22. This act of creation shows us that God cares about our need for companionship and community, and desires us to live in relationships with others. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 23, we see that Adam recognizes the value of having a partner, saying, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." Which reminds us that we are all connected and come from the same Creator. Further, God blessed them and instructed them in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28 to be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. And in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, He also commanded them not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, saying that if they did so, they would surely die. However, Satan disguised himself as a serpent and tempted Eve with fruit from the forbidden tree, which we can see in Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. He told her that she would become wise like God if she ate it. Eve succumbed to his temptation, ate the fruit, and gave some to Adam with her. When God saw what had happened, he cursed the serpent for his part in deceiving Eve. He also punished Adam and Eve for their sin, and told them that they must now work hard for their food, contrary to his original plan, which we could see in Genesis chapter 3, verse 17, where he told Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life." Lastly, God sent them out of the Garden of Eden and barred them from ever returning. Thus, Adam and Eve's disobedience and sin caused them to be driven away from the perfect paradise God had created. The fall of man brought death into the world. We now move on to the story of Cain and Abel, which illustrates how sin can cause deep divisions and hurt between people. In Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, we learn that Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain was a farmer who worked the soil, while Abel kept flocks of sheep. As the story progresses, we can see that Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, whereas Abel brought the firstlings of his flocks and the fat portions as an offering, as written in Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. Both the brothers' offerings are from their work, but we see in Genesis chapter 4, verse 5, that God respected Abel's offering but not Cain's. We do not know exactly why this happened, but it could be that God may have seen Abel's offering having been more heartfelt than Cain's. It made Cain very angry, and he was filled with envy. As said in Genesis chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, the Lord saw this and asked him, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." However, Cain did not listen to God's word but lashed out angrily, spoke to his brother Abel, and angrily killed him. Later, when the Lord asked him where his brother was, he replied, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" As said in Genesis chapter 4 verse 9. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 10, the Lord said to him, "What have you done? Listen. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." Cain was then cursed and banished from God's presence. He was no longer allowed back in the Garden of Eden. However, God showed mercy on Cain even after he committed this horrible deed by giving him a mark, so that no one would kill him in revenge. Cain and Abel's story warns about the consequences of envy and sin, and teaches us that jealousy can lead to hatred and even violence. And we now move on to the story of Noah and the flood. It all started when God saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and decided to bring about a great flood to destroy all living creatures. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, God said to Noah, "I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth." And in Genesis chapter 6 verse 17, God continues by telling Noah that, "I am going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it." Then he instructed Noah to build an ark out of gopher wood, with rooms inside it, and pitch it inside and out so it would be waterproof. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 1, God also commanded Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation." So Noah went into the ark with his wife, their sons and wives, and pairs of animals, birds and livestock to keep them alive during the flood. Later, the Lord shut Noah and his family inside the ark, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Then, finally, the waters rose over the mountains and covered the whole world, except for a mountain peak where the ark rested. After 150 days, when the water had receded to its normal level, God sent out a wind to blow over the earth's surface and made a rainbow as a sign of his promise never again to flood all living things with such destruction, which we could see in Genesis chapter 9 verses 13 to 15. Then in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, God said to Noah and his sons, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the earth." Noah was then commanded by God not only to rebuild, but also to live righteous lives, so as not to repeat this kind of sin. In order for there never to be another flood like this one ever again, as we can see in Genesis chapter 9 verse 11, God made a covenant with humankind through Noah, saying, "Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." So, through God's covenant with Noah, he promised never to destroy all living creatures with a flood again, and also commanded Noah to live a righteous life and be an example to his descendants. After God made a covenant with Noah never to destroy all living creatures with a flood again, humankind continued their lives. However, instead of living righteous lives as commanded by God, they chose to defy God's plan and build a great tower known as the Tower of Babel to reach heaven and make a name for themselves. It was when everyone on earth spoke the same language and decided to build a tower that would reach heaven as a symbol of their pride. So Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 says, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech, and they decided to build a tower." And in Genesis chapter 11 verse 4, they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." So, for building the tower, in Genesis chapter 11, verse 3, we could see that they used bricks instead of stones and tar for mortar as their material. God, however, was not pleased with their arrogance, and he confused their language so they could no longer understand each other, forcing them to stop building the tower, and they scattered worldwide. In Genesis chapter 11, verses 6 and 7, the Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." This story reminds us that we are not in control, but only God. Therefore, we must be careful not to exalt ourselves too much, for God will humble us if we become too proud. We must never forget that God alone is worthy of our worship and praise, and seek His will rather than our own. Now, let us turn our focus to the history of the Israelites. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, the Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." In Genesis chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram journeyed on until finally arriving at Shechem in Canaan, and in Genesis chapter 12 verse 7, we could see that the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land," and Abram built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. In Genesis chapter 12 verse 8, we could see that he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. As said in Genesis chapter 15 verse 5, "Look up at the sky and count the stars if indeed you can count them." And then God says, "So shall your offspring be." In Genesis chapter 16 verse 16, Abraham had a son, Ishmael, through his wife's maidservant, Hagar. Ishmael was born when Abraham was 86 years old. When we move to Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 and 16, God promised Abraham a son through his wife, Sarai. As we progress to verses 17 and 18, we can see Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." In Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 to 7, we see Sarah, who was barren, become pregnant as God promised to Abraham, and bear a son to Abraham in his old age. And the boy was named Isaac, son of laughter, as Sarah laughed when she heard she would have a child at their old age. Further, a set of events is happening in Abraham's life. However, in Genesis chapter 22, we could see that the Lord tested Abraham's faith by asking him to sacrifice his son Isaac on Mount Moriah as a burnt offering. It was an impenetrable demand for any parent to make, yet by trusting in God's promise that he would keep his descendants, Abraham obeyed without hesitation. The Lord was pleased with Abraham's obedience and spared Isaac. Even though Abraham had endured such a difficult time, God gave him hope and comfort. As written in Genesis chapter 22, verse 17, the Lord said to Abraham, "I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies." This covenant still stands today, providing hope and safety assurance for generations throughout history. In Genesis chapter 25, verses 7 and 8, Scripture says, Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. And he was gathered to his people. With Abraham's faith, obedience, and hope, he did not go unrewarded, and God kept his promise and blessed Abraham with a son, Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Paddan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord answered his prayer. Rebekah became pregnant, which is written in Genesis chapter 25, verses 20 and 21. Further, Lord had blessed Rebekah so that she conceived twins. However, the children struggled together within her womb. So she went to inquire of the Lord, and in Genesis chapter 25, verses 23 to 26, the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Esau grew up hunting while Jacob stayed at home tending the flocks. As time passed, Isaac favored Esau due to his skill as an outdoorsman, while Rebekah favored Jacob. When Isaac became old, he intended to bless his heir, as written in Genesis chapter 27, verses 1 to 4. When Isaac was old, and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son." "Here I am," he answered. Isaac said, "I am now an old man, and do not know the day of my death. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." However, Jacob and Rebekah plotted a trickier strategy. Jacob tricked his brother and father and took away his brother's birthright. In Genesis chapter 27, verse 19, we could see that Jacob went to Isaac, his father, and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am." "Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game, so that you may give me your blessing." After deceiving his father and gaining the blessings, Jacob realized that Esau would try to take revenge, so he had to flee his homeland. Jacob then went to his uncle Laban in Haran. After arriving in Haran, Jacob worked for his uncle Laban for 20 years. During all this time, he got married, had 12 sons, and learned the ways of the land. After that, Jacob wanted to return home, but first, he asked Laban if he could take leave from him. Laban agreed and permitted him to return to his homeland Canaan with all his wealth, family, and flock. In Genesis chapter 32, verse 28, Jacob encountered God at Peniel before he left and wrestled with him all night. After the long fight, Jacob was given a new name, Israel. This name means one who strives with God. After 20 years of separation, Jacob returned to Canaan and met his brother Esau. He feared that Esau would take revenge on him for stealing his blessing. But instead, Esau embraced him, and they made peace, as written in Genesis chapter 33, verse 4. Finally, in Genesis chapter 35, verses 1 to 7, we could see Jacob arrived in his hometown of Bethel, where he had previously encountered God and been renamed Israel. Here he built an altar to the Lord and worshipped him, and as time progressed in Genesis chapter 49 verse 33, we could see, when Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. This story reminds us that God is faithful to his promises. He will never forsake us. If we trust him, he will give us more than we can imagine. So let us keep trusting God's promises, for he is always faithful and true. Jacob trusted God and received his blessing. After his encounter with God, Jacob went on to have a prosperous life. Similarly, Joseph also experienced God's faithfulness and blessings in his life. Now we shall move on to Joseph, the 11th of 12 sons of Jacob and Rachel. Genesis chapter 27, verse 28 says, "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine." As we read Genesis chapters 29 and 30, we can see how Jacob was blessed and married to Leah and Rachel, and how they had 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Genesis chapter 37, verse 3 states, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him," which indicates how much Jacob adored his son Joseph, so much so that he made him a special garment. As we progress, we can see Joseph himself dreamt 2 dreams in Genesis chapter 37, verses 6 to 11, where he said to his family, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Further, in Genesis chapter 37, verses 4 and 5, it is written that Joseph's brothers were so jealous of Jacob's affection towards Joseph that they plotted to kill him. However, they did not kill Joseph, but were later sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers, as written in Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 to 2. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Joseph's master's wife falsely accused him of rape when he refused her advances, making him go to prison. Genesis chapter 39, verses 7 to 10, says, "And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, 'Come to bed with me.' But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, 'My master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?' And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her, or even be with her. One day, while Joseph was in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were also imprisoned. Having witnessed God's favor on him before, they asked him to interpret their dreams as written in Genesis chapter 40, verses 8 to 13. "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." Similarly, the baker shared his dream, and as we progress through the chapter, we can see that Joseph interpreted the dream, which happened as he interpreted, so that the cupbearer was restored to his position and the baker was executed. From Genesis chapter 41, verses 1 to 45, a series of events is about to start in Joseph's life, from when the Pharaoh himself had 2 dreams which none of his magicians could interpret. Then the cupbearer remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about him. In Genesis chapter 41, verses 14 to 16, we see that Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you, that, when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Then Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, indicating that there would be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. He advised Pharaoh to appoint someone who could oversee food collection during the plentiful years to have enough food supplies during those 7 years of famine. Impressed by his wisdom, Pharaoh appointed Joseph second in command in Egypt, giving him authority over everyone except himself. Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 to 44, says, "The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, 'Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way." Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift a hand or foot in all Egypt." Later, when famine struck Canaan, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt from Canaan to buy food. However, they did not recognize Joseph as the second in command and bowed before him as per his dream. Genesis chapter 42, verses 6 to 11 says, "Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So, when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. 'Where do you come from?' he asked. 'From the land of Canaan, to buy food,' they replied. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, 'You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected.' 'No, my lord,' they answered. 'Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies.' After testing them for a while, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers and told them that God made it possible so that he could provide for their family during this famine. In Genesis chapter 45, verses 4 to 8 says, "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come close to me.' When they had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt." Eventually, Joseph's father, Jacob, and his family went to Egypt. Joseph lived till he was 110 years old. Genesis chapter 50, verses 22 and 23, says Joseph stayed in Egypt, along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also, the children of Machir son of Manasseh were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. At the end of Genesis, Joseph was reunited with his family as they had gathered in Egypt, as Genesis chapter 50, verses 24 to 26 says, "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am about to die. But God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.' And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, 'God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place.'" The book of Genesis ends with the death of Joseph. Joseph was a great leader and a man of faith. He could interpret dreams, and God used him to save his people from famine. Joseph's descendants lived in Egypt for many years. They experienced both good times and bad times. The Egyptians eventually enslaved them, but God raised Moses to lead them out of slavery and back to the promised land. The story of Joseph is a reminder that God is always with his people, even during difficult times. God is faithful to his promises and will always protect his people. The blessing of the second son is a recurring theme in the Bible. It appears in the stories of Abel and Cain, Jacob and Esau, and Joseph and his brothers. In each of these stories, the second son is chosen by God over the firstborn. There are several possible explanations for this. One possibility is that God is simply showing his sovereignty. Human conventions, such as the law of primogeniture, do not bind him. He can choose whomever he wants to bless, regardless of their birth order. Another possibility is that God is showing his grace. The second sons in these stories are often not the most deserving. Abel was a shepherd, while Cain was a farmer. Jacob was a trickster, while Esau was a hunter. Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob, while his brothers hated him. Nevertheless, God chose to bless these men. It shows us that God's blessings are not based on our merit. We cannot earn God's favor. He chooses to bless us out of his love and grace. Also, we must remember that no matter how dark our situation may seem, we can find hope in God's promises and rely on his strength. May we always trust in him and seek his will for our lives. The book of Genesis is a powerful reminder of God's love and mercy towards us. From the beginning of creation, God has been reaching out to us and offering us grace and redemption. His story of redemption began with Adam and Eve, continued through Abraham, Noah, Jacob, and Isaac, and ended with Jesus, our Savior and Redeemer. The creation story in Genesis is a powerful reminder of God's power and majesty. It also teaches us that God is a God of order and design. The fall of man is a tragic story that teaches us about the human condition. We are all sinners and fall short of God's glory. The history of the Israelites is a story of God's faithfulness. Despite their many failures, God never abandoned his people. There are countless other stories within the book of Genesis that we have yet to discover, and we have tried to explore all the major events discussed in the first book of Torah. Join us next time as we continue to explore the wisdom of the Torah. Thank you for watching.